going here. Let's see.
Right. You doing pretty good this morning?
Doing well, just trying to shake off doing all that online stuff.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we're on.
Doing well.
All right. Well, it's good to have us this morning. Glad people are tuned in live. I know Justin said his wife was having some seizures this morning, so he wouldn't get to come, and we want to be thinking about him this morning and his family. Hope she's doing well. And Mike Cornett was going to continue teaching, of course, his introduction to Revelation, but his garage flooded really badly. So he and his son are over there right now trying to dig a ditch. So trying to get that situated where he can get his garage cleared out and dried out. So then we're just glad that we can meet this morning and appreciate you all, of course, being with us online. I know we've had some say that they couldn't be here in person, but they'll definitely be listening online, so we're glad that you're with us. Welcome to Holston this morning, and we'll get things kicked off. Of course, as always, our four foundations. Basically, we know these: a hope of heart, sovereignty of God, a non-literal approach to how we understand the scriptures, a thinking faith, and a preterist perspective. We ask you this week, if you would, during your prayers and meditation time, remember, of course, our other churches within our fellowship, the ones in Ohio, Kentucky, Virginia, and of course other parts of Tennessee. I ask you to remember those will be traveling. I know Sharon will be traveling with her daughter and my daughter. They'll be going to the beach here next week, I guess, or the week after. So remember them. Then we've got some others too who've been traveling, so out and about. So we're hopefully that we're hoping that things will go well. There won't be any issues, and everything will go smoothly with that. And then, of course, remember our folks that are undergoing medical procedures coming up. I know Reese will be having, of course, his other surgery will be coming up, and we hope that that goes well. There's no further issues. He's had some issues related to that, and hopefully we can get that taken care of, get him back to 100%, get things back on track. And thinking about this, I just saw a little while ago that our good friend Harold McKinney just passed away, and Susan, his daughter, had posted it on Facebook this morning, and I know their hearts are broken. Really think a lot of that family, and it's always nice to go to the Scotsman here in town a few years back, and we'd meet for breakfast every morning, me and Harold and a group of us, and we'd have a BLT, a coffee, and get to catch up on things and see how everything's going. So, of course, Harold was the local State Farm agent for several years here in our area. Always really enjoyed being around him and our talks, and just having fun. So we ask you to remember his family too this week as they go through that process. We know that's a real heartbreaker for them. I want to remind everybody to tune in every Wednesday night, or Wednesday evening, Wednesday night, whatever your time is, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the Wood Pulpit Podcast. We've been going through the letter to 1 Corinthians, and that's been a good study so far. You can see it live on Facebook, on our Facebook page for the church, or you can join us on Zoom if you want to join us on that discussion. If you've got some areas of interest or something that you'd like to chime in on and help us maybe understand some more insight on 1 Corinthians, we'd invite you to join us on Zoom. You can go to our page and see where to do that. I also like to tell those that have been giving, those have been giving here at the church or on our Facebook page or our PayPal account. We've had some that have been pretty consistent on giving, especially on the PayPal account. I want to tell you thank you for that, and that's going toward some improvements here to our building and some things outside, some other projects we've got going on. So very thankful for that. Appreciate your donations. And do remember, these are all tax deductible, so if you're thinking about giving, we'd advise you to do that. Not telling anybody they have to, or not putting pressure on anyone, but we are thankful for those that have a heart to do that and have the means to do it. So thankful for that today. And next, we're going to get into our lesson. Our lesson for today, I've entitled it a question. What is a Primitive Baptist Universalist? Because we know that's a mouthful, and we get that question a lot of times. They've heard maybe of Primitive Baptists, or they've heard of Baptists. They've heard of Universalists, but that's a mouthful when you put all those three descriptors together to describe our fellowship and other churches involved in our group. Primitive Baptist Universalists as a distinct group have existed since the early 20th century, and we're not going to get into all the history of it at this point, but we just want to do maybe a basic understanding of what this means, why we take that position, because I've had some tell me, well, if you put that on your sign, people aren't going to come, or people are going to be confused, they won't know what you believe, they'll think you're a snake handler, or who knows what they'll think. So this will help. I know I've had some email me, ask questions about our beliefs. Recently, I've had a professor from New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary asked for a description and maybe our theological positions, just trying to get some understanding of this. I think this project he's doing on different Baptist groups, and sometimes it's hard to get feedback from certain groups, and this can be rather difficult. And of course, we've got a pretty good online presence, so he contacted me, and I told him, of course, I can speak for our little group, maybe, or what we represent. I can't speak for all of them, but this will be a basic 101 for what does it mean, why do we say that that's what we are, and why do we identify that, why it's important. What is, of course, to be primitive? What does that mean? What does it mean, of course, to be Baptist? And then we'll look at, lastly, what is it? What do we mean by Universalist? Because that can mean a lot of things. All these terms can mean so many different things, and we want to give our distinctives as to what we mean by that. We'll first talk about what the word primitive is not, what we don't mean by primitive. The term primitive for us doesn't mean backwards, ignorant, or uneducated. It doesn't mean that we reject modern technology, medicine, or culture. It is not anti-intellectual, and it's not anti-rational. We're not against the Enlightenment. I know there's some conservative groups that, especially religious conservatives, that seem to be very anti-Enlightenment. They don't like even what would be considered classical education, because they say, well, it's not distinctively Christian enough. We don't reject any of that. We're not rejecting lots of aspects of Western culture or Western history. So we're definitely not anti-intellectual, anti-rational. We're not purely emotional. We don't practice spiritual healing, snake handling, speaking in tongues, or magical interpretations. So don't do any of that. We don't believe that just by sheer revelation that we come to understand the truths that we find ourselves believing. We do believe in solid exegesis of Scripture and history and all those things that inform us, and we gladly embrace reason and logic and rationality as a good place for us to be rooted in empiricism and consistent, cogent perspectives. So if it gets a little too supernatural, a little too magical, we sort of reject that. But we definitely don't practice healing, anointing people. There may be groups out there that do that. That's fine. That's just not what we represent. And again, there may be groups that want to handle snakes. They can knock ourselves out all they want. If Sharon will start doing that, we'll let her do that outside the church. So, or speaking in tongues. I mean, whatever traditions want to do that, go at it. We encourage you if that's your tradition. That's just not our tradition. That's not ours to come up with these weird interpretations just for the sense of being different. So no magical interpretations either. And lastly, we're not King James only. So we reject that right out. There are lots of Primitive Baptist and conservative groups that hold a King James only stance, and we really repudiate that as being ridiculous and silly, because that's only a translation. So no translation can stand as infallible and inerrant and those sorts of things, because again, translations are produced by human minds who are full of fallacy and everything else. Not to say that these translations aren't trustworthy or lack veracity or cogency. We don't outright reject the King James Version of the Bible. It's just we don't represent a position as this is it, and this is God's Word, and if you don't have that, then you're hell-bound. And we definitely don't hold that position. So that's what primitive is not. It's not these things. It's not having old buildings that don't have air conditioners or bathrooms or electricity. We're not Luddites. We don't reject again, modern technology or convenience or things like that, or even culture. We don't have people come in and tell us that we shouldn't listen to Ozzy Osbourne or heavy metal, or I grew up in a tradition like that where they came in and told you not to listen to Ozzy Osbourne if you play the record backwards, and Satan's going to tell you to go kill your mother. I listen to plenty of heavy metal. I haven't killed anybody. I haven't hurt anybody that I know of. So I think it's been okay. I've even listened to Rammstein, and I've listened to Five Finger Death Punch and some pretty hard stuff, just because it's interesting, and it's not what I exclusively listen to, but there's lots of different music. People went ape crazy when Elvis came out. It's interesting. We've got the Elvis movie that came out lately, and you can see there how ridiculous people were. Playing that old dirty rock music. We ain't playing that old dirty rock music. That sort of, we reject all of that sort of nonsense as far as our perspective. We do not mean by primitive that we're conservative. I guess is what I'm trying to say is we're not conservative. We don't embrace that. What do we mean by primitive? Okay, because that's what everybody thinks. They think, oh, you must reject all of that. No. The term primitive for us carries the meaning of original. So when we talk about primitive, we're talking about the original. We believe in the vision that the original Baptists developed during the English separatist movement in the 1600s. The first Baptist churches, of course, were formed by English speakers in Holland from about 1609 to 1612. We do not, like some fundamentalist Baptists, claim that we go all the way back to John the Baptist, because there are some that make that silly argument that, well, John was a Baptist, so that was the first Baptist church, was the ones John baptized. That's not what we believe. We understand and hold to the fact that history shows that there was a Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions. Out of that came, of course, around the 1500s, the Protestant Reformation with Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli. And out of that came other movements. So it really took the Reformation and Luther and Calvin and Zwingli to bring it to a point where some felt like they didn't go far enough with their reforms. So this is where you get the English separatist movements. They came out, of course, out of English-speaking ideas, because by that time, in the 1600s, King Henry, we know, broke with Rome over the fact that he wanted to get a divorce, and the Pope wouldn't grant a divorce. And hell or high water, Henry's going to get a divorce because that woman was horrible. And Henry just kept going through women. We know that after those episodes of history. So what he did was he took he lopped off the Pope as the authority for the Church of England, and he made himself the authority of the Church of England. So the crown is the head of the church. Even to this day, the head of the church is not the Archbishop of Canterbury, even though that's a high leadership role, but the head of the church actually is the Queen. So the English separatists felt like the reforms weren't going far enough, that they went to a certain point. So that's where we get that Baptists separated from the Church of England because they believed church membership should be voluntary and that only believers should be baptized. So what do we mean by Primitive Baptist? What has this got to do with what we believe right now? Well, it goes along with this. They rejected the parish structure of the Church of England, where people were born into the church and baptized as infants. So there was this heavy emphasis, and we'll look at that in just a moment, but we kind of, it's hard for us to understand as Americans because Americans are used to this idea of separation of church and state. It hasn't happened yet. This is what we want to get into, is the fact that they're still in this position of ecclesiastical law came under, ecclesiastical law would be enforced by civil authorities because they were pretty much the same. John Smith led the first congregation, we know, in Holland. Thomas Hellas traveled back to England, and he founded the First Baptist Church in England in 1612. The First Baptist Church of North America, of course, was established by Roger Williams in what is today, of course, Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island. It's the First Baptist Church we know of. Okay. Thomas Hellas returned to England in 1611. His wife Joan was imprisoned in England because of their separatism. He founded the first church there, the First Baptist Church, but he wrote a very important document. This is something that anybody should really study. It's very interesting. It's a more of a religious philosophy, and it's called The Mystery of Iniquity, written in 1612. It was the first plea for religious liberty in English. So it called for Christ to be the head of the church, not the king, not the crown. And he said that the king has no power over your conscience. And he also called for religious freedom for Jews, Turks, for heretics, and for all non-Christians. So they're not just arguing for their own liberty, but for all religious liberty, all for free thought. And this is where it ties into what we're about. We're about free thought, and that's why our movement, that's named Primitive Baptist Universalists, is tied together with this original. That's why we call it primitive. It's original. We believe in these ideas of free thought. Why was this dangerous? Why was the separatist movement dangerous? Because it was a question of loyalty. Baptists were accused of heresy and treason. Politically, as we'll see, Baptist logic severed the concept of citizenship from membership in an established church. Until that time, it hadn't entered into consciousness of people, the idea of citizenship from membership. Because you just assume if you're a citizen of England that you're a member of the Church of England. Or if you were a citizen of France, you were a member of the Catholic Church. If you're a member, or if you're a citizen of Germany, you're a member of the Lutheran Church, because the Lutheran Church is the official church of the German nation. But Baptists argued for this separation. One could be born an Englishman, but one had to be born again to be a Christian. That's where we get that thinking about being born again in Baptist language. Yeah, you can be born English, you could be born American, but we have to be born again. We have to be a Christian. The church consists only of Christians under the rule of Christ. So this is what Baptists were arguing. the powers that be, both civil and ecclesiastical, were scandalized. Why did this scandalize it? To monarchs, the threat was very real. They couldn't have a lot of people believe in this. Can you have a stable, their question is this, can you have a stable national order or a secure throne if your subjects are not subservient to your priests? This had been the MO, the modus operandi for all nations, for all nation states, for all societies, till time immemorial. Now, it was unique because we're looking in where Mike has been introducing us to the book of Revelation. We're going back in history, and under Rome, they did allow for certain religious freedom, just like the Persians did. That's why when you go back in the Old Testament prophets, they call Cyrus the Persian Cyrus the Great, because, and they even used the name Messiah for Cyrus, because he let them come back to their land and rebuild, and there was some religious toleration, but not the freedom to this point. Not quite like what Baptists were arguing at this time in history. So kind of keep all that in mind as we go through. So there were legal concerns. How can societal order be maintained if civil law and church law are totally separated? This is not, King James I could not fathom this. Because just like Prince Charles now, they call him the defender of the faith, in England. So what that means is if you're the defender of the faith, you have to guard souls. So you're in a sense almost like a pastor. You're guarding the souls of your citizens. Can government wield true authority if the most it can threaten is execution? Whereas throughout all history before, we saw that John Huss and others that were burned at the stake and excommunicated. Excommunicated didn't mean you could just get kicked out of your local church. It meant you were bound for hell and there's no hope for you. And that's, an edict from the civil authorities. The civil authorities would, again, enforce the edicts of ecclesiastical authority. How could a person be excommunicated by a church and remain in good standing with the state? That's why if you were considered a heretic, it wasn't like now where, at our church, we don't mind people calling us heretics, like whatever. Now, we're happy heretics. That's fine. At least we get to have fun and explore ideas and not get tied down in nonsense. But at this time, that was a real conundrum for civil authorities. So how in the world could we how could you be a good citizen and not be a part of a local church, not be in good standing with your church? Now, some of that may be in our culture where we think, well, if you're a good citizen of America, you're obviously going to be a good church member. That may be somewhat in our mind, but it's not to the extent that it was here, because they really had this concern. And it was a true legal concern. To most modern people living in Western nations, and particularly to us, like I said, to Americans, the idea of the state serving as a guardian of souls and protector of orthodoxy probably seems crazy. But this is what led to all the religious wars that were going on. People were going to war over how to baptize or how to conduct the Lord's Supper and those sorts of things. Lutherans and Calvinists and Catholics all fighting with one another. So their crown, whether it was the emperor, whether it was a king, whether it was a prince, they were considered to be the protector of orthodoxy. That's why when Martin Luther brought up these disputations, this 95 Theses that he nailed to the castle door at Wittenberg, and he wanted to have this open debate, you'll see later on in his life, he's brought to what's called the Diet of Worms, which was where he had to stand trial for his heresy. And that's where he famously said that he couldn't recant. He couldn't recant any of his writings because he couldn't do it in good conscience. It's the first time we really have that come about in history where an individual could argue for such a thing as having freedom of conscience. So this is where the Baptists took that and ran with it. It's like, no, well, we need to have more than just what Luther was advocating. So to King James I and his bishops, the same idea seemed obvious. It seemed obvious to them that, King James was the protector of the faith, the protector of souls, and he had to be on guard. Baptists soon felt the fury of that persecution because, of course, they were, that's why lots of them, either fled to Holland or the Netherlands, or they came to America to seek. When we talk about religious freedom, people think, oh, it's just because churches were hard on each other or something. No, it was the fact that you could go to jail, you could go to prison, and they could hold you in prison because you were a Baptist, or you were not a part of the Church of England, or you would not hold to those beliefs. So we mentioned Roger Williams before. Roger Williams is an important part of what we consider to be the original Baptist philosophy of freedom of thought. And Roger Williams, he argues, in 1644 he published his most famous book. I've actually got an excerpt from it here. This is a book called The American Mind, and it's various essays from different periods throughout the development of America. And during the colonial period, this is where Roger Williams wrote The Bloody Tent. The Bloody Tent of Persecution. In it, Williams argues that the king has no right to coerce belief, confession, or conviction. I'm not going to get into all his arguments here. It would be well served to go look at that, because if you're interested in individual liberty, if you're a libertarian or whoever, I would argue anybody to go back to Roger Williams and see this is a really interesting development, especially in the colonies, because he was rejected by the New England Puritans, because the Puritans were okay using the arm of the state to enforce their ideology and their religion. This is where my libertarianism kicks in, is I admire the Puritans for some of their thought and for their education practices, and there's lots of things about the Puritans to be admired with their work ethic, things like this. But I don't admire anybody that's willing to use the arm of the state, because the state is the one that has a monopoly of violence. I can't just go out and because I'd be a vigilante if I was to go out and to try to exact vengeance, or try to just arrest somebody without some authority. The state has the right to do lots of things because they have a monopoly on being able to carry out violent acts if necessary. And this is where, of course, a lot of classical liberal thought comes from. It comes out of these disputations. But Williams, again, he saw the church as separate from the world, a vineyard that belongs to God. This is where you're going to start seeing this language. It winds up in Thomas Jefferson's lips about separation of church and state, this wall of separation. It comes right out of Roger Williams. He insisted the church, the world, must be separated by a wall or a hedge between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. So the wall and the hedge, we'll look at that. Thomas Jefferson, later on, he becomes president. Thomas Jefferson, he was presented 1,325 pounds of cheese made by Baptist women in Massachusetts, delivered to the White House by one Elder John Leland. And I'm not going to get into John Leland today, but he's a very important figure in original Baptist or Primitive Baptist thought. But John Leland, in appreciation of Jefferson's support for religious liberty, but writing to the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut in 1802, Jefferson had borrowed the language from Roger Williams, defining a wall of separation between church and state. And the reason it had to be that way is because we don't need the state enacting violence. And I don't want the state. I don't want the police to go out and arrest people and put them in a cage because they don't believe what we do here at our church or what we're advocating for. So that's why it's very important. I know where people are coming from, because they're being told that that our founders were all a bunch of Jesus freaks, and they built this country on the notion that Jesus is Lord, and that's just not true. Not to say that they didn't love Jesus or the Bible or their faith. It's just they weren't fundamentalists. I don't know of any of the fundamentalists among the founders. These were all very stately men who, even though they may have been very serious about their faith, understood that there was a diversity of beliefs, especially in the early colonies. So this was the best way forward, and Jefferson saw what Roger Williams had done earlier with this notion of separating these things out. So original or primitive Baptists, what do they believe? Well, first, let's try to sum it up this way. They believe in Bible freedom, the freedom to read and interpret the Bible based on one's conscience and spiritual understanding. This comes from Luther's understanding in the Reformation. Luther's the one that said, here I stand. I can do no other. So he would not recant because his conscience and clear reason would not convince him to believe in indulgences and all sorts of things that the Roman Catholic Church said must be believed, and was willing to use the power of the empire, the power of the state, to enact violence on those that would not adhere to it. So, next is soul freedom. The soul's freedom from the imposition of clergy, creed, or civil government. It's not up to the government to enforce your belief on the Apostles' Creed, or the Belgic Confession, or the Westminster Confession, the London Baptist Confession, or a clergy's interpretation of it. You don't have that right. You have a freedom. Church freedom. The local church is free to govern the way that they see fit without hierarchical restraint. This is another reason why we're Baptists. We don't have a home office. We don't have anybody giving us our marching orders. We have a good fellowship, and we have people, some that are very educated, some that may not be as educated, but they're very bright and very skillful and very good thinkers, and that's why it takes all of us working together to make this work. And that's the beauty, I think, of the Baptist understanding. And then ultimately, religious freedom. Individuals in the church are both ordained. Let's get this straight. Individuals in the church are both ordained with freedom of religion, freedom for religion, and freedom from religion. So I don't hate the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Dan Barker and I cannot remember his wife's name. But anyway, they're very outspoken. I don't agree with their methods sometimes. I don't agree with the fact that they're in Wisconsin and they come down to Elizabethton, Tennessee, trying to tell them they can't cross. That, I think, should be a matter for us local people to get involved in that. But anyway, I don't have a beef with the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I think they do a good work because it should keep us on our toes, and it should keep fundamentalists going back to the fact that Baptists were originally for freedom of thought for everyone. Whether, so you have a right of your religion, for your religion, and you got a right from religion. You don't have to be hassled. So, is that Baptist thought? Well, it may not sound like Southern Baptist or the Primitive Baptist, but that's original Baptist thought. So Baptists in early American life, the American tradition of religious liberty, ensconced in the Constitution and more fully elaborated in the Bill of Rights, owes a lot to Baptist belief and practice, because lots of them gave their lives and were very outspoken. Baptists were first religious group to adopt separation of church and state. They were for this. Lots of things Baptists have been for, even in the 20th century. While never denying proper authority to civil rulers. So this is it. We're not saying that the state doesn't have a right to exist. Now some will argue one or the other. Baptists don't accede to the notion that the New Testament gave civil rulers any authority whatsoever to compel religious belief. Nowhere in the lids of the New Testament we're going to find that, of course, everybody will go to Romans 13, that you're supposed to just somehow just bend over and take it from the government. And that's not at all what Romans 13 means. But there's nowhere in there that says that any of them can compel you to believe whatever they want you to believe. We see that pretty obviously in church history by those that would not, Mike will get into this some in his introduction to the book of Revelation. That's why a lot of them are being persecuted, because they would not give sacrifice to the emperor. They would not participate in emperor worship. And the only ones that really had a reprieve from that were Jews, because it has so many problems with them. They're just trying to placate them. And they said, okay, you've got an exemption. And the problem was no other religions had that exemption. You had to give your sacrifice to the emperor. You had to give it up to Roman imperial power. And lots of early Christians, they weren't willing to do that. So Baptists especially are not willing. I'm not willing to do that, and early Baptists weren't either. Rather, religious commitment was a matter between the human person and God, and civil magistrates should respect the religious conscience of all persons. So I don't expect to go down to the local Hawkins County Commission and have them enact laws or anything else that comes strictly to the point of having to enforce my vision on everybody else. I do expect them, hopefully, to have a decent understanding of what it means to have a budget and not to spend money frivolously. But I can't have them enact what I think should happen as magistrates, as far as enforcing a religious belief. So, what's some takeaways here? What can we take away from this? I know this is kind of a short one-on-one on what original Baptists believe. There's a lot there in that philosophy of freedom of thought. But religious freedom is not about letting fundamentalists run anyone's life. Again, that's why I say that Baptists are against taking the arm of the state. We should all be against that, taking the arm of the state to enact our vision on everybody else. Now, there can be differences of opinion and some debate about lots of different things, about economics, about law, about education, all these things, and there is a religious component to a lot of it. But as far as explicitly religious ideology, I don't have the right to enforce that by the arm of the state. That's dangerous. And again, that's very American for us to think that way, that we have freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. What's another takeaway? We need to know our rights. Otherwise, we're going to lose them. So know what your rights are. That's very much woven into the fabric of what it means, especially in early America. Our country's founders, who are of different religious backgrounds themselves, knew the best way to protect religious liberty was to keep the government out of religion. So they created, of course, the First Amendment, guaranteeing this separation. So, it's very important. Now, some argue about morality and things like that, and we can have those discussions. That's all good. But when it comes down to, again, ecclesiastical matters, we have to really parse that out. And be thankful for the fact that we have freedom of thought. I can't declare somebody a heretic because they don't hold to our creeds. Now, we don't hold tightly to any creeds. Like I said, our basic foundational principles, you find us kind of discuss that every week. It's the sovereignty of God, a non-literal approach to the Bible, a thinking faith, and a preterist perspective. This is kind of our guiding principles. It doesn't mean you have to believe in it. People can come to our church and they don't have to believe anything. They can believe in Native American religion. They can believe in no religion. They can believe in humanism. What does it really matter? We're trying to promote free thought and free thinking, And that's what Primitive Baptist means. It means we believe and understand this is God's world. He's sovereign. How in the world do you want to, thwart God in some way because you didn't do quite the right thing that you thought you should? Or what people think is they'll say, well, God created everything, but he just stays so upset and mad all the time because he just can't get things done. And here you come along with your weird beliefs, really just screwing God over because you got these because how many times in churches have I heard over the years people come in and say, let's just pray God have His way. If God don't have His way, how the hell is He God? You don't have a God. You've got Greek gods, and we just went and watched Thor the other night, and all these gods are fighting with each other, and there's Gore the God Butcher, and all these things. This all seems weird to me because they're not really gods; they're just superhuman people. Doesn't have anything to do with being a God. The very definition of the God that's the creator God of the universe is all power, all knowledge, and thankfully it has all of the grace and all of the benevolence that's needed. So He's omnibenevolent. Usually someone or some being having that much power, it's not going to be threatened because we have maybe some odd beliefs or they just don't line up correctly.
It's more like the powers that be were the ones offended.
Yeah.
They're the ones, that's the people putting God
Yeah.
in their images. They're projecting their beliefs onto the others. So this is what God thinks, when actually I think that means it's what we think.
Exactly.
That's just my interpretation.
Exactly. Well, this is what Roger Williams argued. That's why I say there's some good excerpts here from his disputation with John Cotton.
What was that book again? Will you share that with us for those who didn't catch that book from which you're reading?
Oh, this is called The American Mind.
And that is where
This is essays.
it discusses Roger or
It's got excerpts from Roger Williams.
Roger Williams,
His-
not the other guy, not the original guy. I
No.
remember briefly touching on that, but we didn't really go in depth
Ellis.
in that.
Yeah, Ellis. I've got some other
You have some
articles
stuff.
from Ellis. Yeah.
So let me write that down again. That book is called
This is great though. If you want to get an understanding of each era of the development of American literature and philosophy, the American mind.
The American Mind.
Yeah, it's like an anthology,
I don't think I have been introduced to
I'm
that
sure.
one yet.
but it's very good. I mean, everything from the Transcendentalists to which I love Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman was my favorite anarchist, and
Yes, I've read about her,
yeah.
but this one is just a collection.
Yeah, it's like an anthology, of course.
Okay.
I mean, you could look up Roger Williams, The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, and see there these discussions, because again, he's sharing these concerns, and even one. I just want to read one passage from his book. He talks about permitting of the most paganish, Jewish, Turkish, or anti-Christian conscience in worship. So when he's talking about Turkish, I'm sure he's talking about Islam. And he says anti-Christian. That's Roger Williams felt like it was important to have free thought. I mean, again, going back to what we think of primitive, we do not use the term primitive to mean conservative or closed off. We embrace the Enlightenment ideas. Steven Pinker wrote a book here in the last few years called Enlightenment Now. It's one of my favorite books, and it's because it celebrates the power of the Enlightenment, this focus and emphasis on reason, empiricism, rationality. It was only then that you got rid of this superstitious medicine that was being practiced. I mean, it's amazing how recent a lot of medical procedures have come about. And it was the abandoning of this old magical, supernatural way of thinking and embracing rationalism and reason and logic. And empiricism gives us that notion you have to be able to prove something empirically. That if you can't prove it, if you can't show it over and over through testing, then maybe we should abandon it. So this comes as a result of Williams and others, especially early Baptists, embracing a lot of the Enlightenment ideals, especially freedom of conscience and liberty of mind. That it's only through that, and I know that Sharon, especially being an educator, we promote that. I promote that here. You promote that in the schools, where if you don't let children explore multiple perspectives and multiple cultures, they really become insulated and isolated. And I remember, I guess it was Mark Twain. Yeah, Mark Twain said the surest way to destroy ignorance is travel.
Yeah.
And what he meant by that, experience these different cultures. Now, there's no reason for any of us. There's just no reason for us to think that we could embrace a closed-off way of life, especially now with the internet and everything that we're exposed to. So they can burn every book. These conservatives or whoever, or liberals, whoever's burning books, it's always somebody. Somebody's got to burn books and protect the kids, just like King James protecting the souls of his, of all of his citizenry. We always have to protect somebody, and in the name of protection, we have to keep them isolated.
And it's so sad that we have moved so far away from, because I've been, been out of the study of things like this, and we touched on this years and years ago.
Yeah.
But to see this again reminds me of this original primitive, and when we're talking about what you just defined as primitive, your primitive in-depth study of this makes me realize how far we're removed from this, and Roger Williams' concept makes more sense. It's more reasonable, but our American culture and our politics, the big political machine, has us so far as the masses in our country, so ridiculous with this us or them, where we can't even say words. If we say, we said that we were liberally minded, we're about free thought, they will automatically say you're this side, and that's not true, because on the flip side of that, we can hold conservative beliefs, like we actually are probably more fiscally minded than some, but yet they don't look at that. They automatically see those catchwords like we're liberally minded, we believe in studying, but they automatically have that brand on those terms, that we're so full of nonsense as a culture. And I'm not knocking, I want to be careful not to judge, because I don't want to fall into that us versus them.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the whole culture, not the people.
Yeah.
Because it's the people who were pulled into that. I've been pulled into that. It's us and them, which we can be, we can be fiscally conservative here. We're not going to go out and bring in $30,000 strobe lights for this little church, because we couldn't afford to do that. You couldn't afford to do that for the church. We're just starting out. We're fiscally conservative. We can be conservative in beliefs. We're not going to go out here and run naked through the streets saying, give us freedom. So my point is what I take away from this is we need to have more of that reasonable thought that the original Baptist, as I'm reminded, because I've seen American culture of that semi-quasi, Christian belief here now under the Baptist, to where sometimes I look at that term and I think, oh no, I don't want to go there. But when I look back to you bringing it out from what the Roger Williams and the thoughts in the beginning, it makes more sense, because they weren't so caught up in that you're with us or against us, you're on the right, left, as we've progressed in that whole identity, the identity of politics.
Yeah.
You're here in that box. So we can say, as a people, as a church, we can believe in that process of thought, thinking and questioning, liberally minded, yet we can also have those conservative beliefs that we're not going to go out here and blow everything we have. We're going to take care of our families, even though I know I've been guilty of probably spending sometimes too much money sometimes, as we all have. But we can believe in maintaining a budget and still think. People have made thinking such a curse word. They have demonized, but it's not what God doesn't want, it's what they don't want, because when you think, you are disrupting that control. The puppeteers who are using these things, you're not upsetting God, you're upsetting the people who are benefiting from that train of thought. So I really appreciate this in-depth study, because it makes more sense when we look back into the history and really take that time, because, you know, even though being a historian myself, I still, you know, we touched on stuff like that, but I've been so far removed from it that it's good to have that in-depth look at it again. And I think we all as people need to look back into that and say, this is something we need to move toward, because our not generation, it's always been going on, but this culture, this political spouting off of stuff, well, you're just one of those liberals, you're just one of those conservatives. Those words, those terms is what makes me sick of politics in general, like that. You know, I like that free thought, but, you know, with reason and responsibility. And I think that we've gone away from that. The masses, that we're just so caught up in arguing over that we as a major population, we're not really seeing that, and we're just pulling all this when really we have that common ground. I think most of us in general would have that common ground.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why that it's important to think through these matters and, again, make the mistakes or explore different ideas. I know, so I mentioned the fact of Emma Goldman. She was an anarchist. I'm an anarchist in theory. I think it's
Yeah.
definitely, I would push for that, but again, you'd have to be a disciplined person as well. But the problem is that if you need people to tell you what to do and lead you, I don't know how qualified you are to choose your leaders. So that's the problem that we have, is that's the conundrum of democracy and understanding those kind of processes. But it's important for us to always keep in mind that freedom of thought is a blessing. And it's not something that's been experienced for most of human history. Most of human history is involved with burning witches or burning people that had free thought, women that were too mouthy, or fellows that were rabble rousers, or, you know, that sort of thing. But you can have a good balance and be disciplined. Again, I think I like what Sharon's talking about. Some get the idea that you're just going to be naked libertines running around going crazy and killing babies and sacrificing puppies or whatever it is. And there are kooky people on every side of every issue. I've seen some kooky conservatives and liberals and libertarians and all sorts of kooky people. But that's humanity. But the best we can do is, of course, let people think. And that's what we promote here, and that's part of our church tradition. All right, next time we're going to look at why we use the term Universalist. We're going to introduce you to Elhanan Winchester, who was a Baptist Universalist in the early days and very influential. Just a wonderful study there. And of course, Clara Barton. Clara Barton had a big impact on the tradition we have in our area. Actually, a lot of our churches grew out of her influence. There's one of the other churches up in Virginia where it's just a legend, but she was supposedly helped use that church during the Civil War and nursed there. So her universalism and her grace and her showing of Christian love and mercy to whoever that she met had a big impact on some of our theological ancestors and their lives. So it'll be a good study. We'll look through that. And again, Universalist can mean a lot of different things, but I think, well, I hope that you'll understand it comes back to that notion of we believe in promoting free thought and allow people to be grown-ups and think for themselves. And we're not telling that you have to adhere to any of this, but just present this for your consideration and hope that it'll be a help to you. So that's all I've got today. I know I brought the map for Mike, so he'll have that for next time, and I hope he gets his garage cleaned out and there's not a lot of damage. You can get that squared away. And Justin and his family, we're thinking about him today, and his wife. We hope that she's okay. Definitely be thinking about you all this week.
Reese.
And Reese. And then, of course, Harold McKinney's family will be thinking about them. We'd ask you to remember our little group here and just keep tuning in, and we hope that everybody has a great Sunday. So that's pretty much all I've got today. So thank you all for tuning in.